Hello.
Hola.
Bonjour.
Привет. 你好.
Hello and welcome to Language with Chu. Today we're going to talk about something very simple actually, yet I hope to show you that it's actually a lot more complicated than it seems. If you watched my previous videos about sounds and meaning and language complexity, you already have an idea of where I'm trying to get to. But I'll start with the simplest question of them all. What is language? And by working on that definition, I hope that is not too language nerdy and that you get a lot of ideas about how language works and why the state of linguistics or the state of the science of language is kind of stagnant nowadays. One of the problems is that like in any science, most people try to find a very simple definition for something so that the theory, that's the hypotheses that they're testing, will make sense, will be able to be tested even, the experiments replicated, etc. Well, linguistics, it's a little bit in between because it's the humanities, but some currents of linguistics have been trying for decades to make it more scientific. So it's a little bit between both sides, and you can forgive some linguists for being too scientific and missing the forest for the trees, or some others for being too wishy-washy in their definitions. But the problem is that with language, I think you can't just focus yourself on one simple definition. In fact, I hope that in the examples that come next, you'll see that everything in language is complex and everything in language requires more than one dictionary definition. Okay, so let's start with what is language. If I were to ask you how many abilities you need to be able to speak, to use language in general. And here, just a note, when I'm talking about language, I'm talking about the language capacity, not each individual language, okay? So what do you need to know? From a physical point of view, from a mental or cognitive point of view, and from a social point of view, what is the set of skills that you need in order to speak? And I would suggest that you pause the video here and think about it, make your own little bullet points, and then resume watching and see if you got them all. I probably missed many, but I think you're going to be surprised. Okay, so I'm assuming you just you paused the video and did that little exercise if you felt like it. But let's start with the physical things that you need to have and to know. First of all, you have to have parts that work. You need to have lungs to breathe. You need to have a heart. If you're not alive, you're not going to be talking. You need a functioning brain. You need everything that makes you a human being to talk, right? That's number one. And they need to work for language. For example, the way we use breath, our breath when we speak is used in a specific way to materialize language. Otherwise, you could just be breathing without making any noises, any vocalizations, and it wouldn't be called speech. Second, you need a neuromuscular complex, I would say, because we have roughly, I think, 700 muscles in our bodies, and about 78 of them are muscles that we use for speech. Just for speech, or not just for speech, but mainly for it. So that's a lot, and you need each tiny muscle and nerve and everything to help you articulate the sounds you make, so produce sound. They need to help you control how you articulate things, otherwise nobody could understand you. And they have to make it as easy as possible for you to produce sounds. So all that is an entire mechanism working in the background while you use speech. You have a lot of skills that you don't even realize because they're subconscious, basically. Then you need the larynx, and the larynx is this it's basically just the voice box that we have. Some people call it the voice box, but it's just 2 inches long. It's not very big, and without it, we couldn't speak either. But the interesting thing is that it's involved in many functions together with language, and you'll see this more and more and more. There's hardly any unique thing that we could say, this is only for language. For example, in the larynx, we use all this part of our necks to swallow, to breathe, to cough, and there's minute mechanisms going on in the larynx to allow you to talk or to swallow, not to choke, etc. So you need the larynx. You need something called the hyoid bone. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's this floating little bone kind of inside here. You cannot really palpate it, but it's studied nowadays for for problems with sleep apnea. It's used in forensics for determining if somebody was strangled or not. And it's as a funny trivia, I'll tell you that if anybody asks you which is the only bone in the body that floats, you can say it's the hyoid bone. It's not quite correct because it's not like floating on air, but it's a bit like the patella, like the kneecap. But this one is particularly, here in the image you can see how it really looks like it's floating. It's connected by a bunch of ligaments and little muscles and stuff, but it doesn't articulate with other bone. So that's why it's said to be floating. Well, this little bone is interesting because it's right in the right position to help the tongue move, to help the larynx open and close so that you can speak or swallow or eat, etc. And animals have it. Animals have a larynx too, many animals, but they don't have it. They don't have them in the right position to allow for speech. It's commonly believed that the larynx, one of the things that made humans speak was the larynx, the descent of the larynx. For some animals, it's very, very high, so it doesn't allow for the whole cavities that we have, resonance cavities and stuff, and it won't. There's no much difference between the sounds that we can produce for vocalization and the piping for eating, say, or for breathing. In our case, humans, we have the larynx quite low, and that creates enough room and enough of levers and pulleys and things that allow us to do both, breathe and eat and speak, etc. But I'll tell you right now that that's not really true, because many animals already also have a lower larynx, and it's not because of that they speak. So it can't be the only factor. None of these are the only factors, but they all contribute to speech. You need a bucconasal cavity, so everything resonates from your nose to your cheeks to everything in your mouth, your teeth, etc. In my videos about phonemes and sounds, I described how each sound in language is placed in the mouth, and they each have their names, etc. If you're interested, check that video too. And then you have a brain. Obviously, you need to have a functioning brain. And again, there's so little that is known about it. You will hear that this area, Broca's area, or Wernicke's area, is for language. And although there is some specialization, and language is mostly seated on the left hemisphere, there's many cases of injuries where the brain immediately kind of takes over and or compensates for the part that is injured and uses something else. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, okay, here's my language, my language center or whatever. Not to mention that, as we'll see in a minute, we need so many skills to speak and to use language that it seems like the whole of the brain is lighting up when we speak. Also, the studies that we can do nowadays with brain scans and brain MRIs and etc., they're quite limited if you think about it, because all we're showing is brain activity as in electricity, and maybe some neurochemicals acting, and maybe some chemical activity. But it's not the whole banana, because if you think about it, where is it stored? How does it work? The amount of words you know, the amount of knowledge you have about the world. I did an MRI once, and my brain looked quite tiny, I mean, I speak 3 languages really well and 3 others not so well, and I have no idea how it could fit into my small brain. Maybe you have a bigger brain, but anyway, I don't think that explains language and how it works. I think it has to do more with the connection between brain and mind. So everything that is non-tangible, but that we usually assimilate with with the brain. Okay, and finally, I'll go through these quickly. You need the vagus nerve. I've spoken about the vagus nerve in previous videos too. What's interesting is that, as I just said, the brain is not everything, and the vagus nerve, not only does it have the whole right side, the right branch that controls, that helps you regulate a lot of your facial movements, it also has a very important pro-social role. And also it reaches all the way down to the gut. And recently, or not so recently, scientists found out that 90% of our of the branches of the vagus nerve go up to the brain. And you know what also is in the gut? Neurons. There's a lot of neurons. So again, nobody knows how we think, how we feel. Maybe most of the time we're thinking with our guts. I don't know. Anyway, you need that to speak as well. And you also need gestures, and for many linguists, gestures are kind of like the beginning of language. I don't quite agree, and if you watch the previous videos in this series, you know why. But gesture, I would say, is important for language, and the more you know how to use them, the more you can use them, the better for language. Okay, so that's it for what you need to do physically. And if you notice, all of this is almost subconscious, or you don't really have a lot of control over it. You're not thinking, I have 78 muscles in my face that are helping me produce language, right? If you think about it, you might say so, but most of the time we use language spontaneously without giving any of these things a thought. Okay, so I would say that's part of the definition of language if you include what is required for language. Next, we have anything that is cognitive. So what do we need in our brains or our minds to use language? Well, you need memory, and memory of several kinds. You need short-term memory, because say you forget everything I say 3 seconds after I've said it, you wouldn't be able to watch anything, to listen to anybody. You wouldn't be able to keep your train of thoughts, etc. You need a long-term memory to remember all kinds of things about the environment, about the social situations, about a text, for example, about everything in your long-term memory helps you understand language more so than we think often. Then you need something kind of nifty, which is statistics, and we're all kind of experts at statistics if you think about it, because when you learn a language, there are things that are allowed and not allowed. There are sounds, when you listen to a foreign language, there are sounds that just don't sound English, right, to you. You're like, this is a foreign language. Why? Because you're doing all kinds of computations in your head that tell you, okay, these sounds are normal, are allowed in English. Not only that, but these sounds can be combined in a specific order in different ways, and when you kind of shuffle them around, they just don't sound English anymore, right? Well, all those things are kind of statistic work, because you're always working on your own probabilities. When you listen to somebody, your brain is calculating, okay, does that make sense? That makes sense? Is this more likely than not? And if it's more likely, then I can even not hear the sounds and make up the word. If I tell you that I like computers, you didn't hear the C, and maybe you didn't even notice you weren't hearing the C. I like computers. I like computers. And you kind of made it up because statistically you know that computer usually is preceded by a k sound. Okay, and then that shows that there's a huge amount of complexity in what we say. We use language all the time, and it's so easy, or it sounds easy to us. It's only when we meet somebody who's learning our language, our mother tongue, as a foreign language, that we realize how hard it is. And we don't even realize all the knowledge we have. For example, if you're a native speaker of English, could you conjugate the copula in the third person plural simple past? I'd be interested to see how many of you did it, if you can post on the comments. What I just said may have sounded like Chinese, but it's just they were, as in they were happy. The verb to be is called the copula in linguistic jargon, right? Or if I tell you the verb, give me the verb to look in the second person singular, present perfect. Can you do it? he has looked, or she has looked, or it has looked. So see, I know that because I've learned English as a second language, but you don't need to know that. You have all these rules, phonological rules, morphological rules of which chunks of words can go together with which ones. You know all the verb tenses, you know how to put sentences together, all those things. You have no idea how you do it, but you know it. And when some annoying foreigner starts asking about why did you use that tense, blah, 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 and you're like, I don't know, I just use it, right? So a lot of complexity in what's going on in your mind. You need also abstract thought, obviously, because not everything is concrete. You need even abstract thought for conceiving, having a conception of time when you're speaking. You need abstract thought for everything, basically, when we speak. It would be very hard to only focus ourselves on concrete thoughts to be able to have the type of communication we have nowadays. And then you need a whole apparatus of encoding and transmitting. So I'm encoding information and sending it to you. You're decoding it and receiving all the information. Nobody really knows how that works. There is information theory based on some of these concepts, but in the brain, how it works, scientists have tried and keep trying to find out how it all works. But like I said, there's so much that we have inside our brains that it's very difficult to know why and how language really happens. Okay, and then finally, from a social point of view, you need something that is quite human, although some animals have it to a certain extent too, and it's theory of mind. And theory of mind is just a term for describing when you can ascribe a mental state to somebody and predict their reactions and adjust your own behavior. So say I tell you, hi, how are you? And you say, I'm okay. I already know from your expression that you're not really doing okay, so I can't take you literally, and I may ask you, what's wrong? When I'm about to make a request, if I'm a little nervous, I may be trying to figure out if you're in a good mood, if you're not, etc., right? So all those things are theory of mind. And in language is super important because we read a lot of nonverbal cues, sometimes more so than words. Then there's something that goes with it, is that we also have to take other people as agents. If you imagine that people are talking for the sake of talking, some people do, but if you imagine that nobody has anything to say, then you wouldn't try to find meaning in a sentence. And because we see that each person is an agent of communication, we try to find meaning, we try to express meaning, we try to be clear, etc., etc. And then finally, we have to agree tacitly and also subconsciously many times to a huge amount of conventions in language. You have like a whole book, rule book inside your head that it tells you, okay, this comes after this. If the person says hello, I respond, etc. You know that if I tell you again, how are you, and you tell me the sky is blue, I'm going to think there's something wrong with you, right? It's completely out of context. So there's all kinds of social norms. In some languages, it's even more important when there's different personal pronouns, for example, depending on the social rank of the person or the age, like in Japanese. And all those things you're doing at a millisecond. You're processing a lot of information. All of this, basically, that you see on the screen is working at the same time every time you see every time you say anything, practically anything. Okay, and what's interesting is that, like I said on previous videos, these parts weren't really designed for language, or don't seem to have been designed for language, because if you take any of those physical and mental and social traits, abilities, you could say that they're part of a much bigger cognitive complex, or you could say that they're part of a much bigger network of functions that we fulfill as human beings. And each of the little parts, physical or not, allow you to do a multitude of things, not just speaking. So that's a bit puzzling when you're talking about evolution, because, well, which one came first, if we need them all at once? Then, from a more cognitive point of view, language is integral to our lives. I think there's cases of children who were born in the jungle, or from sadistic parents who left them locked up in an attic, for example, till they were teenagers and they were found. And you can see in those children that they actually don't have not just language, but a lot of other cognitive and social abilities that the normal, your average Joe has. So I think language has a lot to do with our general development, and not just our social. It's not just a system of communication as it is normally described. And then finally, an interesting bit about language is that language is very blind. It's completely blind to demographics, to social status, to anything. You can speak differently, but every human being, except for exceptional circumstances, like I said before, every single human being has at least one language. In fact, monolingualism, so just one language, is a minority in the world. Most people can learn 2, 3, 5 languages, no problem, from birth. So that's it for the abilities required in language. I hope it's not too nerdy, as I said, but just think about how smart you are, if you ever are in doubt, for being able to do all those things at once. And here you can see why there is a debate between the camp that says we're born with it all because it's so complex, we could never have learned that in such a short amount of time when we were children, and the others that say no, we learn it all. Obviously we're all born with a certain ability for speaking, but learning has a lot to do with it. And well, the two camps sort of fight with each other. I think both of them are right and both of them are wrong, in that they limit their definitions, and we'll hopefully talk about that in more detail later. But yes, we're born with a certain capacity for language, for sure. Our environment is very important, but just saying that you're born with it doesn't mean that it's all in your brain or your genes. In fact, there hasn't been a lot of progress made in that respect. And just because it means, just because you say it's social and it's learned, it doesn't mean that it's only the care givers that teach language to a child that will have the only say in how it's done, or that will provide the biggest amount of input. I think it's a lot more complex than that. This is just the first slide, so I talked a lot, I think. But anyway, I hope you like it. We'll stop here for this episode, and we'll move on to language functions next. So what does language do? And the types of knowledge that you need to have. Hopefully then to move into these kind of myths that exist around linguistics and around the idea of language, and which ones we can rescue and which ones should really be tweaked a bit so that they match reality finally. Okay, so let me know in the comments if you thought of other abilities that are required for language, if I missed any important ones. I was just trying to summarize, and if you think that language is innate or if we learn it. See you next time.